When someone kills themselves, like the late Chris Cornell of Soundgarden and Audioslave, it's rarely a random act out of nowhere. Sure, it's depression, but depression is different for everyone. In the case of Chris Cornell, where did those dark moods come from? I'm going to try to answer that question in this video, which is part one of a three-part series on Chris Cornell. Welcome to the Radioactive Patient of music, art, and mental health mashup. I'm Allison Strong, your host. And no, I'm not a YouTube therapist. I'm not an influencer. I'm just a person with a mental health challenge and a history of substance abuse. Back in the 90s, the radio stations where I worked played so much Soundgarden, I think that I took Chris Cornell for granted. I mean, I knew about the depression peripherally. I knew about the drugs centrally. That was all anyone talked about. But still, my heart just exploded when on May 18th, 2017, I got the news, along with the rest of the world, that Chris Cornell had thrown in the towel. This is hard for me to talk about. The more I read about Chris Cornell, the more I marvel that we didn't lose him sooner. I think music really gave him something to hold on to. His love of music began, as it has for so many of us, with the Beatles. He was 8 years old and a neighbor's basement had flooded. He went and rescued a stack of waterlogged Beatles albums on vinyl. He dried them off and he put them on his record player and he spun them constantly. When he was 12, he went and saw David Bowie in concert. And David Bowie at that time was coming out of the Ziggy Stardust incarnation into the Thin White Duke. This was a revelation for Chris. He was like, wow, if I'm a rock star, I can live 100 different lives if I want. Chris's upbringing was tragic. His father was a violent alcoholic, and when his parents split, Chris didn't have a lot of affection for his father, so he got rid of his father's last name and swapped it out for his mother's maiden name, which was Cornell. Then he was sent to Catholic school, and Chris hated it. All the judgment, all the punishment, and the conformity. Everybody expected to dress the same way, act the same way, and believe in Christ in exactly the same manner. Another dark force in the story is the city of Seattle. Back in the 50s and 60s, Seattle, like Hershey, Pennsylvania, and Detroit, Michigan, was what you call a company town. And the company was Boeing. But there was a project that Boeing was working on with NASA, and it got canceled. Boeing slashed 60,000 jobs between 1970 and 1971. Unemployment rose to 12%, and neighborhoods, nice neighborhoods, became the hood. In fact, so many people left Seattle in search of work and opportunity that there was a billboard on Interstate 5 that read, "Will the last person out of Seattle please turn out the lights?" This was a period of urban blight and hopelessness, and I can only imagine what it must have been like to be 8 years old and learn that everything that the adults are trying to teach you about life, like work hard, play by the rules, and everything will turn out all right for you, was a damn lie. By age 11, Chris Cornell had slipped into a depression. And the way he spoke about it later as an adult was this. At age 11, you wake up one day and you start feeling bad about everything, but you don't know why. Like overnight, like someone had flipped a light switch. Drugs were everywhere. And from the age of 11 on, Chris and his buddies were experimenting with everything they could get their hands on. Well, one night, Chris Cornell either took too much PCP or got a bad batch or something. He had a very bad trip. It was so horrific that he stopped using drugs like overnight. So here's a kid, right, that's depressed. Now he has panic disorder, social anxiety, agoraphobia, and it's not like he can tell anybody. What's he going to do? Go to a doctor and say, "Hey man, I was taking PCP and now I'm feeling really shot out." No. Chris Cornell. He kept it inside. Chris Cornell was brilliant. He was one of those kids in high school that ace all the tests, but when it comes down to homework, which is also a part of how you are graded, he could never really apply himself. He dropped out of high school. He went to an alternative school, but he got frustrated with that whole learn as you go, learn at your own pace kind of thing. So he just bailed and got his GED and started working a series of odd jobs until he found this job in a seafood restaurant. He makes friends, there's fellowship, it's earthy, and there's tons of free food. And it was when Chris was driving home from work one night that he says he had an epiphany. And this is how it goes. I want to get this one right. I was driving home from work when I had an epiphany. It occurred to me that as a musician, there was no guarantee I'd have financial success, but I was fine with that. So right then and there, I made myself a promise that no matter what happened, I was going to be one of those guys who played music until I dropped dead. Man. You know, kind of like the late Lane Staley, Chris Cornell started out as a drummer, but kind of like Lane Staley, he was comparing himself to drummers in the bands that were getting a lot of airplay on MTV, and he didn't really think he could measure up. He knew from school and also from listening and singing along to all those Beatles albums that he had a good voice and he had a good ear. So he got from behind the drum kit and took his place on the stage as a lead singer, which in and of itself is a double-edged sword. Chris, like I said, was brilliant, very quick study. He realized that you can't just like get up on stage and sing. You have to have kind of like, I don't want to say it this way, but like an act, almost a gimmick. You had to have a certain style, a swagger, an outrageousness to you. It was exhausting, but Chris Cornell mastered his own style, even if people in Seattle weren't always receptive to it, because the post-punk music class consciousness of that time, which is the late 80s, early 90s, was very pro-feminist. And Soundgarden were very, very masculine, with a dense and brawny sound. And then there's Chris, 6'2", totally buff, always playing without a shirt, long, dark, curly hair. I mean, not everybody in Seattle was down with Soundgarden, but it didn't matter. They forged their own path to success. Chris Cornell by nature was shy, and he said that if he wasn't a lead singer, he probably would have been a shut-in. As Soundgarden evolved, Chris was getting an awful lot of attention from people who didn't know him. In other words, they loved what he put out there. They worshipped what was on the surface, the sound that came out of him, but they didn't know him, so they couldn't like him for what was in his heart. Chris said, and this says it all, nobody ever said a positive thing to me until I started playing music. I just find that so sad. Well, that's it for part 1 of a 3-part series. This was Chris Cornell, the early years. We're going to get into the beginning of Soundgarden in the next episode. And this has been the Radioactive Patient. I'm Allison Strong, and until the next time we meet, whatever it is that you're trying to do in life, whatever your dream is, keep trying for it. And I'll do the same, okay? Deal? Deal.